Welcome to the Faith and Feelings podcast. My name is Taylor Joy, and I'm passionate about helping you untangle and honor your emotions, authentically practice your faith, and integrate both into your everyday life so that you can experience the goodness and delight that comes from living in relationship with yourself, God, and others. Thank you for joining me. Let's get started. Alone. Always alone. If you grew up with emotionally immature parents, that's how your childhood might have felt. You played alone, rode your bike alone, spent your afternoons alone, did your homework alone, ate alone, woke up alone, went to bed alone. And even when you were with your family, it felt like you were living parallel lives. You were with them, but it didn't feel like you were with them. When hard or scary things happened, you knew it was up to you to figure out what to do or how to cope. Maybe you felt this sensation of emptiness, this gut feeling of nothingness, and you had no way of knowing that other people didn't feel that way too. These are the stories that often come to mind when adult children of emotionally immature parents talk about their childhoods. They often describe being home like floating in an ocean with no one around them. Today, we're continuing our current podcast series by talking about some ways that emotionally immature parents can impact their adult children's lives. As I mentioned in last week's episode, we are in a series called Adult Children of Emotionally Immature Parents, based on psychologist Lindsay Gibson's book. While it might feel like you're disrespecting or betraying your primary caregivers by considering this topic or even listening to this series at all, the goal here isn't to blame. The goal of this series is to name the reality of our childhoods for the purpose of greater awareness and understanding. Can you feel the difference between those two words in your body? While blaming is often accusatory in nature, naming is a form of honor that is focused on personal growth and healing. In this episode, we're going to talk about what emotional loneliness is, how children intuitively cope when they're emotionally lonely, and some specific ways that emotionally immature parents can affect their adult children's lives. So let's jump in. What is emotional loneliness? This has been a new concept to me, and maybe it's new to you too. I've been learning that there are actually several different kinds of loneliness. And while we often think of loneliness as mainly physical or the absence of people, emotional loneliness describes the kind of loneliness that you can feel even in the presence of others. It results from a lack of emotional connection, and it can sometimes be even more painful than being physically alone. Emotional loneliness is that feeling of being unseen, and Lindsay Gibson describes it as a vague and private experience, not easy to recognize or find words for. While just as wounding as a physical injury, it's less obvious because it doesn't show on the outside. To understand this concept from a different angle, I think it might be helpful to contrast the experience of emotional loneliness with the opposite experience, which is emotional intimacy. So what exactly is emotional intimacy? We experience emotional intimacy in relationships where we know that we can share anything, all of our feelings, what we're angry about, disappointed about, dreaming about, anything and everything. We feel completely safe opening up, whether in words, through an exchange of looks, or just quietly being together. Does anyone come to mind for you when you hear this description? What about your relationship with them fuels this deeper sense of connection? Emotional intimacy is profoundly fulfilling and creates a sense of being seen for who we really are. It can only exist when the other person seeks to know us and not judge us. Parents who have the capacity for emotional intimacy have developed enough self-awareness to be comfortable with their own feelings. That's emotional maturity. And because of this, they can attune to and welcome their child's emotions. While not perfect, they are consistent enough with their attentiveness to form a solid emotional connection with their child. However, when adult children of emotionally immature parents reflect back on their childhoods, they describe it as a lonely experience. Their parents might have looked and acted perfectly normal, caring for their physical health and safety, but while their parents were physically present, they were emotionally absent. Their parents never made this solid emotional connection with them. Because this emotional connection was lacking, these children were left with a gaping hole. They were fed but unseen, clothed but not comforted. Because their parents were too stressed, traumatized, or hurt themselves, they were not able to notice or engage their child's inner experience. In addition to overlooking or discounting their child's feelings, these parents feared emotional intimacy. Because they were too uncomfortable with their own feelings and emotional needs, they had no idea or were too preoccupied to offer support on an emotional level to their child. Such parents might have even become nervous or angry if their child was sad or upset, punishing them instead of soothing them. And these reactions shut down their child's instinctive urge to reach out, closing the door to emotional connection. The result? Emotional loneliness. A question to consider as you listen. Do any of these experiences resonate with you or describe one or both of your parents? If so, I want to give us some space to pause and reflect. Can you remember your earliest experience of emotional loneliness? Do any memories come to mind? Children would have felt the effects of unmet emotional needs, but they wouldn't necessarily have known what was wrong. They would have no way of knowing that this hollow feeling is a normal, universal response to lacking adequate human companionship. That feeling of emotional loneliness was so distressing that the child instinctively learned to do whatever was necessary to make some kind of connection with their parents. Let's unpack that a little bit more. What do I mean by the child instinctively learned to do whatever was necessary to make some kind of connection with their parent? God designed our bodies to instinctively adapt to our circumstances, especially as children, in both heartbreaking and brilliant ways. In other words, connection is a basic human need. We need connection with others to survive. And when a child didn't get adequate connection, then that child learned to get some form of it at whatever cost necessary. What do I mean by this? Gabor Mate talks about this in a way that has been so helpful and clarifying for me. He says that when a child is born, that child has two fundamental needs. The first need is for attachment, which is what we've been talking about. This need for contact, connection, and love. Our attachment or connection needs are enormous and fundamental to our human development. He says that we have to connect, to belong, to be loved by, and to love. These are basic human needs. But we have another fundamental need as well, which is the need for authenticity. He describes authenticity as the capacity to know what we feel, to be in touch with our bodies, and to be able to express who we are in our activities and relationships. But what happens to a child when their attachment need is not compatible with their need for authenticity? In other words, if I'm authentic, my parents will reject me. If I feel what I feel and express what I feel, my parents can't handle it. When children pick up these messages from their parents, whether they mean to convey them or not, what does the child do? Gabor Mate explains that there is no question about it. What becomes suppressed is their authenticity. The child has no choice. They have to choose connection because they can't survive without it. So what happens when that child becomes an adult? Gabor Mate says this. He says, we become 25, 35, or 45, and we have no idea who we are. And someone asks us, what do you feel? And we have no idea. How many times have we all had the experience of having a strong gut feeling, but we ignore it? At some point, we found out that it was too costly in our attachment relationships to be in touch with our gut feelings. So it becomes second nature to suppress our emotions, lose touch with ourselves, and ignore our gut feelings. And it all began with this tragic conflict that no child should be faced with, but many are, between authenticity and attachment. And he continues by saying, this is true with many adults today who want to be themselves, but are afraid to be because they know or they fear that if they are themselves, then they will lose important attachment relationships in their lives. Before we move on, I just want to pause again here and give us some space to reflect. What was it like to hear that quote? What did you feel in your body? Did any memories or stories come to mind? To wrap up this episode, I want to spend our last few minutes together talking about a few more ways that emotionally immature parents can affect their adult children's lives. In other words, how does this experience of emotional loneliness as a child, this forced decision of attachment over authenticity, impact an adult? Lindsay Gibson talks about several effects that I'm going to unpack here. These tendencies don't always connect back to having emotionally immature parents, but they were noticeably common themes in her research. First, she noted that many adult children of emotionally immature parents learned during their childhood to put other people's needs first as the price of admission into the relationship. They took on the role of helping others, convincing everyone that they had few emotional needs. How does this carry into adulthood? Well, people who lack emotional engagement in childhood, men and women alike, often can't believe that someone would want to have a relationship with them just because of who they are. They believe that if they want closeness, they must play a role that always puts the other person first. In their present relationships, they're convinced that they would be bothering others if they asked for help. They don't know how to receive comfort or care from others. Another common effect of emotionally immature parents on adult children is the inability to trust their gut instinct. Emotionally immature parents don't know how to validate their child's feelings and instincts. Without this validation, many children learn to give in to what others seem sure about. As an adult, they may deny or mistrust their gut, and as Gabor Mate said, ignore or overthink that inner voice inside of them. Early self-sufficiency is another common effect. Many adult children leave their childhood behind too quickly. Learning at a young age that other people can't be depended on to meet their needs, they become self-reliant and oftentimes success-driven, functioning so well that other people think that they don't have problems. But beneath their success lingers that childhood loneliness. Although their emotional needs might be met in their current relationships, the effects of early unmet needs might still haunt them through anxiety, depression, or bad dreams. On the flip side, many adult children lack self-confidence. Because of a lack of emotional engagement during their childhoods, they can be shy and conflicted about receiving attention. In this situation, they create their own emotional loneliness by hanging back instead of interacting. And finally, many adult children look at their present lives and feel guilty and confused for their unhappiness. They can't understand these feelings. As Lindsay Gibson says, this is the classic confusion of a person whose physical needs were met in childhood while emotional needs remained unfulfilled. As adults, they can't shake the feeling of being fundamentally alone and lack the emotional connection that they crave in their relationships. As you reflect on these common effects and tendencies, do any resonate with you? I'm going to list them again, and I'd like to invite you to listen with curiosity in regards to your own experiences. They put others' needs first as the price of admission into the relationship. They struggle to trust their gut instinct. They become self-sufficient quickly, leaving childhood behind, or they lack self-confidence. And finally, they feel guilty and confused for their unhappiness. So as we end, I just want to loop back around to this concept of emotional loneliness that we've been talking about today. Perhaps this episode has put some words to an inner ache you've been feeling. As you've listened, maybe you've begun to make some connections between your early childhood experiences and the sense of aloneness today. If this is you, I want you to know that there is a message within your emotional loneliness, and it's a profoundly healthy message. This emotional pain and loneliness is trying to help you. As you learn to listen to your emotions, which we'll talk more about in the next few weeks, they will guide you towards more authentic connection in your relationships. I'm so grateful that you listened to today's episode. Thank you for spending time with me. I'd love to hear from you. Connect with me on Instagram at TaylorJoy or through my website, taylorjoymurray.co. Also, if you enjoyed this conversation, it would mean so much to me if you took a minute to subscribe and review the podcast. This is an easy way to partner with me and is invaluable in reaching new listeners. Until next week.